What's up, everybody? My name is Brad and welcome to the channel. I appreciate you stopping by, hanging out for a bit while I talk about some books. It's October now, so I thought this was the perfect time for me, sort of the perfect opportunity to do a crash course, a beginner's guide on where to read Stephen King books. He has a big catalog of books, like 70 plus books or so now. So if you've never read Stephen King before, that can be sort of a daunting task of trying to figure out where you should start with his books. And also with it being October, for any non-horror readers throughout the year, this is typically the time of the year where they decide to pick up a scary book or two, and maybe they're looking to try Stephen King for the first time and don't know where to start. So I thought I'd put my opinion out there, give you my thoughts on where to start with his books. It's probably not reinventing the wheel at all, but I thought I'd give you my opinion on it. So I've got a couple of different categories I want to cover throughout the video. I'm trying not to repeat books in these categories. There will be some repeat books. But yeah, let's go ahead and we're going to dive right into it. Never read Stephen King. So this is for people who are brand new to Stephen King, never read any of his books before. And really, where to start out is going back to the very beginning, I think is the best place to start. And that is with Carrie, his first ever published book back in like 1974, I think, or so like 50 something years ago. Obviously, his writing style has changed and improved since then for 50 years. But I still think this is a solid place to start with Stephen King if you've never read any of his books before. It's not very long. It's at least this edition, it's less than 200 pages, so it's not a very big time commitment. But you get into the style that he writes and sort of the supernatural elements he likes to tell in his types of stories. And it's a pretty good story. It's a coming-of-age story as well. I quite enjoy this book. I know some people, this is their favorite Stephen King book, which, I can't argue with that because it is a solid story, but it's got some supernatural elements in here. It's not super scary, but maybe creepy enough to where if you're a non-horror reader, this might get under your skin a little bit. And it's way better than the movie. If you've seen the movie, definitely read the book instead. The ending to the book is 1,000 times better than any of the movies. But I think this is a really great place to start with Stephen King if you've never read any of his books. This one's Carrie. Another great place to start, my personal opinion, this is where I started, and it's still my favorite Stephen King book. You probably know what it is if you're familiar with me at all, but that's Salem's Lot. This is a vampire story. I think it's one of his scarier books. It also has it's a big cast of characters, but a lot of the characters are sort of minor characters, but you get so invested in the actual town of Salem's Lot. Stephen King does a fantastic job of making Salem's Lot feel like a living, breathing, real place. And you get attached to all these little minor characters in the book, and then when they eventually die, you feel bad for it. You feel sad. So he pulls that empathy and that sorrow out of you. And like I said, it is a really creepy, chilling vampire tale. There's some really chilling scenes in here. If you've seen the movie at all or familiar with pop culture, you've probably seen the vampire boy coming up to the window from the older movie, I think the TV movie from back in the day. But some really great vampire scenes in here. There's no glitter vampires here. They are here to straight up kill you and murder you. And it's a creepy, great little self-contained town or self-contained story in this small New England town. And I absolutely love it. It's my favorite Stephen King book. And it's an excellent place to start because that's where I started my Stephen King journey. And then finally, the third book for where you should start. If you're looking for like a range of different types of stories Stephen King can tell, I think this is an excellent place to start. And this is Night Shift. This is a short story collection. It's his first short story collection. I believe there's probably about 20 some odd stories in here. A lot of these are pretty famous, have been turned into movies. Children of the Corn is in here. Let's see what else we got in here. Trucks, which turned into Maximum Overdrive, is in here. Funny movie. Graveyard Shift, which I think the movie itself is called Night Shift. More recently, last couple of years, the Boogeyman movie came out. That's in here. It's got one of my favorite stories in here, which is not really a horror story, so it sort of speaks to Stephen King's range. He can write more than just horror, which we'll talk about later in the video, but the last rung on the ladder is in here. There's tie-ins to Salem's Lot stories. There's tie-in to The Stand stories in here. Just all over the place. Fantastic stories. This is this is my favorite Stephen King short story collection. So since they're short stories, they're not big time commitments, so you can kind of get a little taste here and there of Stephen King's storytelling and if you like it or not. And like I said, about 20 or so creepy little tales in here for you to check out. Scariest Books. So if you're coming to read Stephen King, you're probably wanting to read a good horror book, a good scary book, and he's definitely got you covered. So a few of his scariest books, in my opinion. First up, I think this is his darkest, scariest book he's ever written, and that is Pet Sematary. I read this as a parent already. I was already a dad when I read this book, but I think whether you're a parent or not, you can get different things out of it that are truly frightening and scary. I think even more so as a parent dealing with the subject matter here. You're probably familiar with what happens in the book. I won't go into that. But as a parent, you can really feel yourself sort of connecting with Louis Creed and his grief and what he's going through, and put in that situation, which I think is kind of the scariest thing about it, is you sort of feel yourself like, yeah, I think I would do the same thing that Louis is doing. And that's just like a really scary, terrible thing to think about, and just the trauma of it all. And like I said, the grief that goes into it. It's a heavy grief book. So if you're into grief horror, this is also another great suggestion for you. But yeah, Pet Sematary is probably his darkest, like I said, and scariest book in my opinion. Another great scary book. This is probably what, if you say Stephen King, this is probably what most people think of when you say his name, and that is The Shining. The book and movie, I think, are both great. They're very different. They're great in their own different aspects. But I really enjoy both of them, even though they are very different. I like them for different reasons. But I think what the scariest thing is about The Shining, putting all the supernatural stuff to the side, is just the devolvement of Jack, sort of the spiraling into insanity that he goes through, being in this confined, claustrophobic space. You know, they're in this giant hotel, but they're essentially cut off from everything due to the snow, and being in that claustrophobic kind of confined setting, sort of the madness that he spirals into, and his descent is truly scary to watch. And then put that up against, you know, his family being there, his wife and child being in danger because of him, and being a father. Again, that's something scary, sort of endangering your own family like that because you're sort of going mad, going crazy, is truly like a psychologically scary thing to think about, more so than the supernatural elements to it. So for me, The Shining is another one of Stephen King's scariest books. Another one is Misery, and this one is another claustrophobic setting. We've got the writer, what is his name? Paul Sheldon, and Annie Wilkes. Yeah, Annie Wilkes is like one of the most terrifying Stephen King villains he's ever created. But another really claustrophobic story, just these two characters pretty much the whole time in this one setting. And again, it's more the human scares for this one is why I put it as the scariest thing. Just the crazy, the sort of obsessiveness of fans. You see this a lot with, you know, in real life, people obsessed with movie stars, and like the paparazzi, how they hound movie stars and musicians and whatnot. And just like the obsessive, compulsive nature that we have with the celebrity for whatever reason that is. And then what happens when your number one most obsessive, stalkerish fan gets a hold of you, and you're sort of trapped with them, and what goes into that. It's a really chilling tale. Like I said, super claustrophobic, just basically two characters the whole time, Annie and Paul, and they're basically in the cabin, and sort of shows you these, I don't know what the word for it is, how well Stephen King can tell a story just with two characters and just one setting. You know, the strength of his writing ability and his storytelling ability. Misery is fantastic and truly one of his scariest books. And for this section, I've got a bonus book. I'm going to try to do about 3 for each one, but I've got a bonus one, and I feel like this one is one people probably wouldn't put in the scariest books, but for me, I'm going to stick it in there as a bonus, and that is Revival. The ending of this one, I think, is one of Stephen King's best endings. I think it's one of his scariest endings, just sort of thinking about the ramifications and what all is going on, the truly sort of unexplainable horror that happens at the end without going into it. This book also deals a lot with religion and losing religion, finding religion. And I think that is also a scary thing to think about and ponder. But like I said, the ending of it, just sort of the scope of the ending and what happens, for me, is what puts it in one of his scariest books, because it was truly kind of a horrifying ending. And like I said, one of his best endings to any of his books, in my opinion. non-scary books. So we went from Stephen King's scariest books to now talking about some non-scary books. And if you're not familiar with King, maybe you didn't know that he had some non-horror-ish type books, but he definitely does. These three, I'll be honest, I have not read these, but I do know pretty much what they are about or have seen the movies for these. So we'll go ahead, get right into it. First up is The Green Mile. And funnily enough, this one and the next one, they're both prison stories. So Stephen King has this thing for prison stories and sort of telling the heartfelt emotions of that. But The Green Mile is one that, if you're not familiar, you might not have known that he wrote this. I can't remember. It was an interview somewhere where Stephen King said he ran into like an old lady at a grocery store and she picked up, it was either The Green Mile or the next book I'm going to talk about. And she recognized Stephen King. She said, "Oh, I don't like your books because they're all scary." And he said, "Well, I wrote that book." She's like, "I don't believe you." You know, something along those lines, which was kind of funny. But The Green Mile, this is one, it's super heartfelt and sad, pulls on your heartstrings, but it's not a scary book, so definitely check that one out. The next one can be found in the collection Different Seasons. It's Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, another prison story, another non-scary story, but again, has the emotions in there, pulls on your heartstrings and things as well. And then the final one, not a prison story, but this one's like alternate history, sort of sci-fi-ish, and this is 11/22/63, sort of a retelling, a reimagining of the JFK assassination, and then trying to stop that from happening. So some sci-fi in here, some like time travel. There's some other characters you meet in here from one of his more popular books. I won't say what that is, but if you've read it, you probably know. But another one that is not horror, you know, there's no monsters or anything in here, just sort of a straight up kind of sci-fi-ish thriller, alternate history type of tale. Non-supernatural books. So you might be a horror reader, a horror fan, but you're not really into ghosts or monsters and vampires and that kind of thing, and you want more of a reality-based type of horror story. Stephen King has some of those as well. Probably the most popular, well-known one is Cujo. This one's about a giant St. Bernard that contracts rabies and goes on a killing spree, and at the end traps a mother and her child within a car, and they can't get out because he's, you know, roaming around the car trying to get at them. No monsters in here, you know, just down to earth horror, a dog getting rabies, but truly another scary tale for a parent. That seems to be a theme with Stephen King, parents and their kids being in some sort of mortal danger. Again, I read this one really recently. This was one of the more recent Stephen King books I read. And again, being a parent, putting myself in that situation, what would I do if I was trapped with my kid in the car and it's a life or death situation? So scary things to think about, but no monsters or anything like that in Cujo. This is the beginning of a series, and the first two books are non-supernatural. The third book does get supernatural a little bit into it, but the first two are just straight up sort of thriller detective mysteries. And first one is Mr. Mercedes. This is book one of the Bill Hodges trilogy. There's Mr. Mercedes, Finders Keepers, and then the third book that does get into the supernatural is called End of Watch. But if you're wanting just sort of a crime detective mystery thriller type of book, Mr. Mercedes and book two, Finders Keepers, are that. We're following Detective Bill Hodges. In this one, it starts out with a person driving their car into a crowd of people that are waiting in line at like a job fair, and then trying to solve who that is, who that killer is, who is running over people. And the killer's also sort of taunting Bill, the cop, throughout the story, trying to see if he can catch him and stuff. So more of a crime novel, if you're into that. Definitely check this one out. Mr. Mercedes, like I said. Finders Keepers is book two. And if you like those, and maybe want to get into the supernatural stuff, finish it out with End of Watch. And then another one that I've already mentioned, but had to mention again for non-supernatural, this one's Misery. Annie Wilkes, like I said, is one of the most terrifying human villains in any of Stephen King's books. And like I said, there's no supernatural stuff in here, just crazy Annie and how scary she actually is. So this is another perfect non-supernatural read if you are looking for that in your Stephen King book. Fantastical Books. So maybe you are a fantasy reader and you're wanting to branch out, try some horror, try some Stephen King. He definitely has some books I think fantasy readers would enjoy. Typically, fantasy readers are reading big chunkers of books, 800,000 pages, and they're also reading big, long series. So there are some that I think they would really enjoy. First up is the Dark Tower series. It's a 7-book series. Starts with The Gunslinger. This is my favorite book series of any of all time. It's really hard to explain. It's like a great mix. It's like there's horror and Western and sci-fi and fantasy all sort of mixed mashed into one series. And it's sort of the heart of the Stephen King universe. The Dark Tower is sort of the heart, which all of his other stories branch out from. In my opinion, every Stephen King book that's ever been written, regardless of what it is, in some way, shape, or form, ties into the Dark Tower series to varying degrees of hard tie-in to maybe a mention, but there's something that happens within the series that makes everything he ever writes tie into the Dark Tower series. If you've read it, you probably know what I'm talking about, but this is the core of sort of the Stephen King universe that everything branches out from, and it's an amazing series. It's got a great cast of characters, Roland, Eddie, Jake, Susanna, Oy, and you'll just fall in love with them, and you'll be happy with them. You'll cry with them when bad things happen, and it's just an awesome journey going towards the Dark Tower itself. And the ending to the series, I absolutely love the ending. I know it's kind of 50-50. Some people love it, some people hate it, but I think it's an absolute brilliant ending for that series. Ka is a wheel. If you know what that means, you know. But The Dark Tower is the first book in that series. I've seen some people comment when people are reading The Dark Tower for the first time that they should skip The Gunslinger and go to book 2, The Drawing of the Three, and then once they finish it, if they want to, come back and read The Gunslinger. Do not do that. That is like absolutely terrible, terrible advice. Do not skip The Gunslinger because it is quintessential to your understanding and enjoyment of the ending of the series. And if you skip it, the ending is not going to be anywhere near as impactful if you've skipped The Gunslinger. So whoever tells you that, if they do, it's terrible advice. They shouldn't be your friend anymore. Do not listen to them. Do not skip The Gunslinger. This isn't the best book in the world, but do not skip it. It's super short. It's like, 250 pages, maybe 220 pages. So it's not a big time investment. And then book 2, in my opinion, is leaps and bounds better and really puts the pedal to the metal, driving the series forward. But yeah, the Dark Tower series, if you're a fantasy reader, I think you'll love it. Definitely enjoy your time with the Dark Tower series. Up next, more of your classic fantasy story, The Eyes of the Dragon. There's dragons in here, wizards, sort of your atypical, medieval fantasy type story, fairy tale type story. This one also ties into the Dark Tower. I believe this has illustrations as well. Doesn't? Maybe there's a different edition that does. Oh no, there's one. So it's kind of like your classic illustrations in here. Yeah, it's really, really cool, typical fantasy type story that I think any fantasy lover will enjoy reading that one. Another one. This one is one I did not really enjoy myself personally, but I think the average fantasy reader would enjoy this one. This one's Fairy Tale. And like the title suggests, about halfway through the book, our main character goes to this sort of fairy tale-esque type of world and is involved in trying to save the day, take down the evil villain, and bring peace and prosperity back to this fantasy world. I loved the first 150-ish pages of this one, and the rest of it, for me, was a bit of a slog, but if you are a fantasy reader, I do think most fantasy readers would enjoy the fairy tale, fantastical land type aspects to this book. It reminds me of the TV show, and I'm not going to be able to remember what its name is, of course, because I'm talking about it, but it was on like ABC, and like all the Disney characters are in there, like Snow White, and I think Elsa eventually comes in and everything. Crap, what's that show called? I can't remember. If I remember, I'll put the title of it on the screen. But that's sort of what it reminded me of, in a way, of this book, once they go to that kind of fairy tale type of land. So there's fairy tale, and then these two aren't really fantasy type books, but fantasy readers, they read those big, thick tomes, and these are big, thick books. So first up is It. Story of Pennywise the Clown and the Losers Club, and their trials and tribulations of trying to survive and defeat Pennywise the Clown. It's a fantastic coming of age story. One of my favorite not only Stephen King books, but one of my favorite horror books of all time. I just love the camaraderie and the friendship of the Losers Club in here. It is great. And then the last big chunker of a book is The Stand. This is his big, epic, post-apocalyptic book. where Captain Trips, this flu-like virus, basically wipes out America or the world, and then we have these groups of survivors. One's good, one's evil, and they're pitted against each other. Again, it's a big chunk of a book that fantasy readers can really sink their teeth into and devour all the characters and the world building and whatnot. So that's another one for fantasy readers for some fantastical books by Stephen King. Coming of age books. I think one of Stephen King's biggest strengths is writing coming of age stories, writing young kids or young teenagers and the adversity they go through. He is fantastic at writing children characters. So we've got a few coming of age stories to recommend. First up, from different seasons, is a story called The Body. You've probably heard of the movie that was adapted from that called Stand By Me. And it's just a story of a group of friends and their sort of adventures that lead up to finding this dead body and what happens to them and their friendships once that happens. It's a fantastic coming of age story. Really, really enjoyed that one. Next up, this is a book that I feel like people sleep on, that people don't really talk about. I really love this book. That is The Institute. This is one of his more recent ones. It is about an institute that's like out in the woods that kidnap children that have some sort of gift. It's like, the telepathy, telekinesis type of gifts. And this was a really good story. I really liked it. Again, these kids, they're stripped away from their families, taken to this place, and tests are performed on them and stuff, all because they have some sort of special ability. I really, really enjoy this one. And the story structure for this one is kind of strange. You spend like the first 100 pages with this one specific character, and then they sort of disappear once we meet the children, and they don't come back again until like the very end of the book. It's an interesting structure to the story, but again, really enjoyable. Another fantastic coming of age story with a great group of kids that you get attached to in this sort of dark institute, evil, science-y place where they're doing tests on the children and whatnot. This one was a lot of fun. And like I just mentioned a minute ago, probably his best coming of age book is It, again with the Losers Club. I love all the kids in here for different reasons. I'm not going to remember all their names, but Ben, Eddie, Beverly, they're all fantastic kids. They're all funny in their own right. Richie is another kid. But yeah, just their friendship and their camaraderie, becoming friends, hanging out with each other, and just like the crap talk they do to back and forth with each other and the horseplay, they feel like real kids. Looking back on your own childhood, you probably did some of the things that they do here in this book. Really, again, Stephen King writes great, really believable, authentic children characters, and it really shines through in this book. And the ending of this book for me is so sad and bittersweet. I won't want to say why, but like the last sentence of the book is just so sad, based on how great a friendship this group of kids had. And that last line is just like a gut punch, just like a mean gut punch right at the end. It's a fantastic story, great coming of age book. The short stuff. Maybe you don't have a lot of time to commit to books, or you're intimidated by the big chunkers of It, The Stand, and things like that, and you want to lean into Stephen King, maybe ease into it and dabble a little bit, see if you like it. So this is some shorter stuff, some novella-sized stuff, some short stories that I think would be a great place to start. First up is the book If It Bleeds. This is a collection of 4 shorter novellas. It also does tie into Holly Gibney is in one of these, the title story If It Bleeds, and she is a character from the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, the Bill Hodges trilogy. But this one has one of my favorite novella-length pieces that Stephen King has ever written. It's called The Life of Chuck. It's, again, another interesting story structure, starting at the end of a person's life and then working backwards. And it's been turned into a movie that's coming out, I think, next year, fairly soon. Tom Hiddleston is playing the main character. It's directed by Mike Flanagan. It seems to be like it will be fantastic because I like both of their works, and it's a really fantastic story. There's some great stories in here. Again, novella-length stuff, so not super big time commitments. His most recent book is a short story collection, You Like It Darker. I really enjoyed these stories. Some of the best Stephen King stories I've read outside of Night Shift. Some of them, just to name a few, Two Talented Bastards, Danny Coughlin's Bad Dream, Rattlesnakes, The Answer Man. Some really great stories in here. And if you have read Cujo, The story Rattlesnakes is a sequel to that. Some people said it wasn't much of a sequel, but the dad from Cujo is the main character in Rattlesnakes, so I think it's like a very hard tie-in sequel, in my opinion. I didn't get like, oh, as loosely, you don't have to read Cujo. I think you kind of should read Cujo first before you read Rattlesnakes. Again, that's my opinion. But some really great stuff in here, especially The Answer Man. The Answer Man might be my favorite story. There's a lot of stories in here about, getting older and where like things like talent comes from, and, where do we go in the afterlife? What happens next? Looking back on life, reflecting back on life and things you've done. Sort of like sentimental in a way type stories, but really solid stories in this one. And these two I've already mentioned, but Night Shift, his first short story collection, my favorite short story collection. Pretty much every story in here is really, really solid and ties in a lot to his other stuff, like Castle Rock, Salem's Lot, The Stand, a lot of tie-ins in there. And then another novella collection, different seasons. This one's got some great ones in here as well that I already mentioned. Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption, Apt Pupil, The Body, and The Breathing Method, all of which I believe have been turned into movies. I know the first three. I don't know about The Breathing Method, but really fantastic stories in this one as well, that if you're wanting something shorter, novella length, this is another great place to check out. Bonus. So I wanted to give you a few bonus categories, a few other suggestions on how you should read or start reading Stephen King. This first bonus category ties into The Dark Tower. If you read through the Dark Tower series, there are some hard connect other books that you should read to tie into that, sort of the expanded reading list for The Dark Tower. First up is in Hearts in Atlantis. The very first story in here is called Low Men in Yellow Coats. That is a hard tie-in that if you enjoy The Dark Tower, you should definitely read that first story in Hearts in Atlantis. The book Insomnia is another direct tie-in to The Dark Tower that if you read it, you should definitely read Insomnia. The Stand, another direct tie-in. And finally, probably the most direct tie-in of all of them is Salem's Lot. And I might even suggest to read Salem's Lot first before you read the Dark Tower series. There's a character in here that becomes an integral part of the Dark Tower series later on. So maybe read this one first. But all those are great tie-ins to expand your Dark Tower reading list once you've completed the main series. Another bonus category is nonfiction. You might not know that Stephen King has some nonfiction books, but he's got two really fantastic nonfiction. So this could have fit in either the non-scary book category or the non-supernatural book category. I'm putting them here at the end. First up is called On Writing, which, as its title suggests, it's a book about writing, about figuring out how to write. But the first part of the book is like autobiographical about Stephen King growing up, learning to read, getting into reading, getting into writing, and his love for storytelling, all the way up through writing his first couple books, like Carrie, The Stand, Dead Zone, things like that. And then the second part of the book is sort of his guide and his knowledge on, what you should do to become a writer, sort of his toolbox and his tips and tricks and things like that. It was a really fascinating, interesting read. Even if you're not interested in being a writer, I still think you'll get something out of it, like I did. And another book that I'm listening to now on audiobook, actually a brand new edition of the audiobook just came out 1st of October, 2024, this month. And that is Danse Macabre. It's sort of Stephen King's take on horror as a genre as a whole. Movies, books, radio, all kinds of different stuff like that. Comics, everything. Movies, I can't remember if I said movies or not. But it's really interesting and intriguing so far. He's been talking about movies he watched growing up as a kid and sort of horror as a whole and sort of its influence on us as a collective body of people. And he's been talking about movies like Blair Witch and things like that. It's really cool and fun so far. So those are two nonfiction, if you're into nonfiction, suggestions from Stephen King: On Writing and Danse Macabre. And then the final sort of bonus suggestion is if you are a sort of a completionist, or, and if I mentioned this earlier, but if you're not familiar with Stephen King, all of Stephen King's books tie in together in some way, shape, or form. Some are hard connects, like Salem's Lot hard connects to the Dark Tower series. Some are just minor things, like the Castle Rock series. Those books sort of mention different towns and places and events, but you don't really have to read one to enjoy the other. But in some way, shape, or form, everything Stephen King writes is interconnected. So sort of the final thing I'll give you, which is kind of maybe a no-brainer suggestion, is to, if you really want to be a completionist, is to read Stephen King's books in chronological order, in the order that they were published in. Starting at Carrie and then going all the way through to his most recent book, You Like It Darker, is another great suggestion. It's something I think I would like to go back and eventually do, is go back and reread what I have read, and also read what I haven't read in chronological order. I think that'll be a lot of fun. Get to see the progression of not only Stephen King's writing and his storytelling ability, but all the different interconnections between the different stories and towns and characters, and just the Stephen King universe as a whole. I think would be a really interesting and fun thing to do, reading through everything that he's written chronologically. And that's it. That's been sort of my beginner's guide, my crash course on where to start reading Stephen King. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know what your first Stephen King book you ever read was, or if you're new to Stephen King, let me know what Stephen King book you're planning to read first. But that's it. That's all I have for you guys today. So I appreciate your time. Thank you for spending your time with me. Again, my name is Brad, and I'll talk to y'all later. Bye.